Welcome to the Planet Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us. The Planet Trillion Trees podcast is happy to announce that we have won 2 Garden Communicator International Silver Laurel Medal Awards for Best Podcast and Best Podcast Episode. We've also won a Garden Communicators International Gold Laurel Medal Award for a Best Podcast Episode. We'd like to thank Garden Communicators for their recognition.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. Monheim Microphones, unparalleled excellence. MonheimMicrophones.com. This podcast is being recorded on August 16th, 2024. Matthew Aghai is a climate tech executive with 20 years of professional experience spanning public, private, and academic ventures in reforestation and natural resource management across the globe. He currently serves the teams at Mast Reforestation and its subsidiaries, but also enjoys a variety of extracurricular functions, including advising and speaking on environmental and sustainability topics, nature-based and technological solutions for greenhouse gases, mitigation, and opportunities to develop durable economic pathways for stewards and skilled workers in the fight against climate change. Welcome to the Planet Trillion Trees podcast, Matthew. We're delighted that we could have you back again with us. It's actually a year ago yesterday, I think, that we had you on. And we're really excited to hear about what you've been up to in the last year. I mean, you've done years and years and years of work in that 1 year's time. So can you fill us in on where you've been and what you're up to?
Absolutely. Well, first off, Eva, Hal, super great to be back. Thank you so much for having me back. Very pleased to be able to come back and reshare now. And I've been hearing about all these amazing stories from all your other guests. So this is even more encouragement to work harder. So maybe in a year, I'll have more stories and tales to tell. So, oh boy, what have I been up to? Well, I can tell you what I've been up to this week. I just got back. I showered up. I cleaned up for you guys. But I've been out in the dust collecting cones. And every once in a while, I get to sneak away from a desk and go out and be in the field with our teams. And at this point right now, we are truly dead smack in the middle of cone collection season. So tree seed collection in the Western U.S. And one of our crews happens to be just a couple hours down the road in the Klamath National Forest region on some private land. And this is basically southern central Oregon, so pine-dominated forests. And we have contractors that are bringing arborists and professionals from all over the country, as far away as Florida and New Hampshire, and Maine and Texas, and all over California and Washington and Arizona. And these folks fly in or drive their adventure vans in with all their equipment. and they meet our contract leads, which are out there collecting cones from trees that we had previously identified over the last few months. So this is really exciting because these are rarer and rarer opportunities in fire-affected parts of the country. And this is a very fire-affected part of the country. So when a pine mast comes, even if it's a small one, it's like an all-hands-on-deck operation. We got people driving around, making sure the cones are mature. We're cutting them and looking at seed counts to make sure they're ready to go. And then we're trying to dial in this ripening, which happens in like a 2 to 3 week window. And we hope that these crews can get there just in time to throw their ladders and gear and ropes up into the trees and gently take all these cones out. And just yesterday, I was able to help coordinate some of the activity, watch them do a lot of this work. And then we were able to take a few hundred bushels to a cold storage, which is an absolute win. And it feels good. Every bushel feels absolutely good because, for pine, as an example, 1 bushel of pine is about a pound of seed in a good year. And a pound of seed is about anywhere from 10 to 20,000 seedlings that we could grow in the future. Now multiply that by the many hundreds or thousands that they're getting. We're going to be using that to replant the forests after the fire. So this is precious and important work. So that's what I've been up to this week. And, we can dive into anything else you'd like.
This sounds like a really good action movie. Yeah. It sounds like the kind of movie I'd want to look at as an environmental person. This is the kind of movie that is dynamic and has a lot of action and a lot of just good stuff. It's great.
I think these crews have a lot of camaraderie. There's young folks that have never done it before. There's the veterans who've done it for years. The crew lead that we work with, he's been doing this for decades, right? And the thing that I think you're right on is someone needs to tell these stories. I know there's a few of us, trying to tell these stories. My format is usually through talking, speaking, proselytizing on it. But there are others who have cameras that I've welcomed in to film. In fact, we have a resident filmmaker. He's our creative and product designer, but he's actually filming a lot of this. So hopefully one day we can showcase some of this work in a more intimate way. And why I think it's relevant is we don't have enough people doing this work. In fact, I talked to the leader of this crew, and he's been doing it for 4 decades. And he's like, I don't have enough people that I can actually, assign to all the people that need this work. And I don't have enough people that can apprentice me and continue this. So he's like, what are we going to do? And the guy's probably not going to have all that much energy to scale this or that much incentive. It's a lot of work, right? So hopefully, maybe you're right. Like we can share some of this. And then, as markets form around this and society's movements kind of, progress, then we can potentially see more people moving into this space and realizing it's a seasonal economic opportunity and a way to have a great adventure in the forest. I mean, imagine being in a treetop for most of a day for a couple of weeks, making good money. It's hard on the body, but like the stories you have to tell, camping under these different forests, the impact you'll have downstream. I mean, that to me sounds like a good time.
Well, it's maybe hard on the body, but it's really light on the soul.
Absolutely. I like that.
It just brings that whole soulful goodness to the picture. Are you connected with ISA at all? Are you plugged in there?
Yeah, we are. We've shared in various formats that this type of work is available. And, we've actually connected a lot of our arborist friends with some of these contractors and crew leads that have been running this kind of work. But what's fundamentally missing are the people that know how to coordinate these collections. The arborists have a very useful skill, but this type of forest, tree, reproductive biology, and the kind of coordination that it takes among the many stakeholders to make this work, the landowner, the nursery, the extractory. That is this very specialized thing that we need to figure out how to scale. Mast has done a really good job by buying some of these subsidiaries like Silvacy, this historic business that has been doing this for 130 years. And now Cal Forest, a nursery that grows the majority of seedlings in the Western US, and creating an extractory there on site. We have created now a catalyzing event which will hopefully create an opportunity to have centralized points for connecting these folks. So in the coming years, I think ISA may actually have a small channel to just feed into future crew leads and people that are coming online. But I think we're just at the beginning. It's just the early phase.
Actually, a big channel should.
Yeah.
I think a big channel, because, there are times when people are working, and I know myself, like you just need to step away from your regular job to do something different, to come back to appreciate what you do.
Yep.
And I think something like this would certainly do the trick for a lot of people. Separating yourself from your location. And I know next week I'm going to Michigan for a whole week for a garden communicators event. And when I go away and I come back with a renewed interest in maybe a new thing that connects with what I was working on and just opens up a whole new door for me. So I hopefully that does that for the arborists that are out there. Do you have a main curator who actually, once the seeds have been cleaned, are they actually there logging and putting everything into numbers and
Absolutely.
spreadsheets?
Yeah. You got it. This is like a highly coordinated and curated process. So if you'll allow me, I can walk you through it a little bit.
Love it.
Okay,
Let's go to it.
And quickly,
Sure.
if I could ask Matthew, for a little color, what types of trees are you collecting seeds on? If you could touch on that as well.
Perfect. Let's start there. So let's constrain this to the Western United States because it'll make it a lot easier for me to kind of paint broad pictures here. So west of the Mississippi River, we have forests that are dominated by conifers, meaning conifers are what evolved to be the main canopy. We have over 90 conifer taxa in the West. And as you get to wetter areas or climate refugia areas that have been evolving for a long time without, glaciers and things like that, you have a higher diversity indexes. So as an example, in Northern California, we have the Miracle Mile or the Magic Mile. I've heard both terms used, but it's an area about a few square miles where you have the most conifer diversity on the planet. So many conifers, right? And it's right below the glacial extent. And this is an area where those conifers have been evolving for a long time and fanning out. In some of the drier areas, you have things like ponderosa pine, one of my favorite trees, but it's dominating in large swaths. And it might be the only species for large sections of dry Western forest types. So when we collect seed, we try to match those tree species that dominate the canopy to that landscape that we're collecting them on. So if it's a really diverse landscape or a not so diverse landscape, we still want to have as much representation in the seed bank as possible. And that's been challenged because over the last, let's call it 60, 70 years, we've really been focused on commercial use of our land. So whenever we cut trees off of these landscapes, we typically would only replant the ones that were favorable to timber or fiber markets. Now, this is good for economies and good for commerce, but it was not so great for ecology and resistance to, some of the challenges that come with degraded systems, right? Impacts of wildfire, beetle kill, frost events, heat events, et cetera.
Yeah.
So as we look at the West and we look at what dominates the canopy, we want to really go by seed zone or by ecotype and go and collect whatever we can that's from the native forest canopy that's left, these older stands from pre-European times, and try to get that into the seed bank so all the restoration efforts can have these reflective genetics, right? But there's another important element that we often forget because of that commercial history. So we're very lucky. Conifers produce seed that, if you dry it down, can store for decades in a seed bank. So that made it great for commerce and for security, right? But what about all the angiosperms on our landscape? There's actually 600 or more different angiosperm taxa in the West that don't necessarily dominate the canopy in the way that our conifers do, but they're still extremely important. Riparian areas, big savannas, oak species like in California that are live oaks and, upland oaks that are really important parts of the ecosystem for all the biodiversity and habitat, and many other angiosperms that are in our river systems, our wetland areas, and then underneath the canopy in our montane environments. So these create fire resilience. They sucker when they burn. They help with habitats. They help stabilize soil. These are extremely important for native and cultural values as well. So we are actually not in a position where we're collecting and restoring those on the landscape. In fact, the few people that do that really work in a boutique fashion around native plant systems or nurseries in these small pockets around the West. The majority of the commercial work is around conifers. That's a legacy of the past being completely built on a foundation of timber and fiber economies. So as we move across the West and we're collecting these species, right now it's really just cones and conifers. And we'd like to expand that into the angiosperms. So now let me zoom into that tagging and processing process. So as we move into these different areas to collect, for instance, where I just was in the Klamath, we have collectors out there collecting from individual trees that foresters and other folks, myself included, have gone and selected for functional traits. So how they look, how healthy they are, where they're located, age, And we're trying to get a diverse sample of trees on the landscape to go into that collection bushel. So we pre-flag all of these. And so the collectors go out and they get up into these canopies, and then they come down onto the ground with their bushels. And then we're writing really elaborate tags that tell us what seed zone we're in, what elevation we're in, what species we collected. In some cases, we might go as deep as providing how many individuals and a GPS point. That's where the trend is heading, is high precision. And that all gets transferred with the bushels, each individual bushel, like 50-pound bags, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, all the way to the extractory where we clean it. And the extractory checks all of that in, just like you said, Eva, into a database, and it tracks it from the cone all the way to dirty seed to clean seed through the testing process. And then even the samples that go to our third-party testing operation in our own labs have like labels and identification numbers with them. And they all go into a database, which ultimately all ends up in our bank. And our bank has all of that information tabulated. And then we're tracking our barrels or boxes in cold storage with very clean labels, QR codes, and a variety of other systems and big inventory systems. So we can go in there and tell you how many pounds, what purity is, what the germ test is. When, we stratify it, will it germinate better? How old the seed lot is, where it's from, what elevation, what slope and aspect, even in some cases. And why that matters is because the best chance we have at those trees surviving and thriving once they're planted out as a seedling is for us to match them to their original provenance, where they came from, or an analog, somewhere that has the exact same characteristics. So that question was really important. Like, this is a very precision effort. This isn't corn where we can just get our bushels and off to market. We have to track every seed, literally. It's amazing.
I used to do floral design. And one of the things that I thought about as soon as you were talking is, what happens to all the cones once they've been emptied? Do they go to market? Because you can make a lot of money on those, selling those as ornamental pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on, actually. A lot of it gets composted because not all the cones are as pretty or ornate as we'd like. But there's the potpourri markets, there's the Christmas markets, and a variety of others. There's even the fuel and fire starter market. So Ponderosa pine is a very beautiful, iconic cone. I wish I had one within arm's reach. But man, that can absolutely go to a secondary market. So at our extractory, when we've opened up all the cones and shaken out all the seed, the intact cones can be ready for a secondary market. That's totally a thing.
And then so there's really not a lot of waste. And the reason why I'm asking that, because my son lives in California, and the other week he sent me a headset, and in the headset there was a box, and I was like, I wonder what's in this little box. Well, it wasn't a little box. It was this pretty decent sized box. So I opened it up and I was like, oh my gosh, he sent me my Christmas present. It was a big Coulter pine cone.
They're amazing.
And it was already half eaten by squirrels, because the squirrels, they say you can hardly ever find a full one because they love the seed so much. And I was laughing. I said, how did you know I needed Christmas in July? It was a perfect gift. And I was smiling for a good week. And so I can imagine how people would react if they saw some of these cones that you're dealing with on a regular basis. And of course, the other question I have for you is, I would imagine that everybody has to walk in this area with hard hats, because if you get hit with one of these 8-pound cones falling out of a tree, that's a hazard.
Yeah, I mean, it varies, like for maybe our grassroots collectors who just interact with our station, they're on their own. But I will say for foresters, professionals like myself who work with large outfits or a lot of these contractors, hard hats are wise. And they're wise not only because something like a Coulter pine hits you in the head, you're going to have problems, but because, in these forests, they've typically burned, there's dead snags, there's a lot of other things that we want to be cautious about. And it's fun because it's also something that creates a culture of safety that helps for a lot of other reasons. So for instance, beyond hard hats, we're also there to protect the forest. So these guys are equipped with shovels, fire extinguishers, and a variety of other equipment to make sure they're not creating problems for the woods. So it's a two-way street.
That's great. Yeah. I'd like to hear that safety.
Absolutely.
Matthew, we were going to ask you if you could talk a little bit about Mast and just the efforts that they make and their general business plan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very proud of what we've built at Mast over the last almost 8 years now. And the company's had an interesting story arc coming from just a pure technology company where we were building aircraft and doing seed biotechnology. And now we are basically a vertically integrated business that is a reforestation supply chain for landowners. And, that's an interesting and much longer story that I could share in an hour. But the summary is that we identified a problem years ago, which was you can build all the technologies, you can add all this value to a system, but if the foundational elements of that system are broken or disconnected, then you got to start there. So as an example, when we were building aircrafts, drones, and we were building biotechnology, so seed vessels to disseminate seed, we quickly realized that there was actually a shortage of seed available in a lot of the systems we were working in. And this problem was becoming acute, not only because it wasn't being collected or banked at a volume that was relevant, but because wildfires are burning more and more and more acres, which is actually reducing the amount of viable forest that we can collect from in a lot of these regions. When you have a 1,000,000-acre fire, that's a 1,000,000-acre of forest that you'll potentially never recover the genetics from, right? So that's a scary prospect. So we said, well, we need to zoom out and actually focus on that problem fundamentally. And in that journey, we realized, well, there are some analog elements of these supply chains, whether it's seed collection or nursery production and science or forestry work like Silvix, where we're actually going out to a site, writing land prescriptions for recovery. All of these fundamentals were geared towards that traditional commercial timber and fiber economy. And the worst thing we could do is compete with that fiber and timber economy because it's all that's left in the fabric of these forest economies in the West, right? So we needed to build something that could be sitting on top of it or in parallel to it. It needed to be accretive. So we need to build something wholly new in our backyards here in the West. And one of the problems that we had with building that is when you look at timber and fiber, it's easy to build a value chain because there's a product. At the end of 60, 80 years, you harvest a tree. Well, how do you incentivize and create commerce for just reforestation? We have to be cynical. Money is the only way to incentivize and create progress, right? So we had an inflection point where we realized we actually need to make that product a valuation around nature. And in our case, forests. Now, we didn't want to focus on the individual unit. We wanted to focus on, large scale reforestation. Our mission is to scale reforestation and mitigate the worst effects of climate change. So perfect timing. We have something called the voluntary carbon markets, the VCM, that's come online. And, that's something that we plugged into directly. So all of this forestry work that we do is in service of selling offsets to a voluntary carbon marketplace so that we can actually pay for this. That's the commerce and incentives that trickle down through our vertically integrated supply chain and help two sides of a marketplace. A landowner who might be devastated by wildfire or beetle kill or some other, destructive force, whether it's slow or fast on their landscape, could just be mismanagement, right? And the other side of the market are corporate emitters. So people who are putting carbon into the atmosphere for their various needs so they can produce products for all of us, like our computers, our software, the AI. Those are all energy intensive, the cars, anything that is in our day-to-day commerce has a carbon footprint. And there's an opportunity for these commercial entities, whoever they are, to pioneer not only just doing this as a regulatory mechanism and compliance, forced regulatory environments saying you should offset your emissions. They can do this voluntarily. And this is good because they can calculate their carbon emissions, offset that, and then tell their consumers and then their communities, look, we are not a destructive force. We are benefiting and making a lot of money, but we're also offsetting our footprint in a way that is beneficial to communities, to ecosystems, to all the things that are impacted by our investment in that offset. So let me connect the dots here. So we have us, Mast, that's a project developer. So we do all this work with the seedlings and planting and forestry work. And that means that we are tending to not only the landowner, but we're the intermediary between the landowner and that offset buyer, that commercial entity, pick your corporation. So we're the middle point. And we create these projects and then we work with regulatory bodies to verify that the seedlings we planted are there and that they're growing. And our carbon modelers, our biometricians measure what we think the future of carbon will be. And then those third parties verify that by measuring the trees physically and then modeling the same And then we say, okay, we are sequestering X amount of carbon now and over the next 50 years, 100 years. And then those commercial entities can come in and pay for that. And some of them are so bold as to prepay for that, because remember, these are carbon futures, right? The trees are going to grow and accumulate carbon over time. And that's really the important piece. Those that are brave enough to invest in their backyards and know the impact of it are the ones that are taking that debt onto their books in service of their communities and these ecosystems. So we work with those pioneers to catalyze that work. And we're grateful for their bravery, but we need more of it. And this helps the landowner, whether it's a mom and pop or a government who might want to enter a program like this, tribal or federal or state, or it could be any commercial entity that's been impacted by wildfire in a way where when we plant new trees, we have demonstrated additionality, which is we are creating new opportunities for carbon sequestration, because if we didn't plant the trees, they wouldn't have grown back naturally. So hopefully that makes sense.
That
was
beautiful.
a terrific overview.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, as an arborist, a lot to take in. And I encourage our listeners, hey, if you have to listen a second time, because I think that does lay it out, especially understanding the role of corporate with carbon offsets.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that's a bummer, you talked about a 1 million acre fire, basically wiping out the genetics.
Mm-hmm.
Anecdotally, can you share anything that takes that a little further?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, this is an opportunity to talk about a paper that we put out this year. And I think it's something that, folks, I would encourage them to go and check out. So this year, I worked with Dr. Solomon Dabrowski. He's a good friend of mine. He's a great science communicator and a fantastic researcher. He's at the University of Montana. So he's an advisor to me. And I had this idea about how do we actually highlight for folks that there's a fundamental problem in the scale of fires that is happening and the reality of actually addressing them, given our condition of our supply chains and our systems. This is a very human caused problem. So if we look at the human available solutions, like, are we even there yet? And he was able to help me constrain my thoughts and then use his expertise in being very close to the data around the fires, around the conditions of regeneration, both natural and then artificial when we go out and plant these areas. And then I was able to take all the information I had on our supply chains, and we were able to basically create this foundation for a paper and invite in technical experts, about 18 other ones, to help us contribute to making this phenomenal paper. So it was called Mind the Gap: Reforestation Needs versus Reforestation Capacity in the Western United States. And we use the term mind the gap. I don't know if anyone's been on a British tube or their light rail, but there's that warning, mind the gap before you step onto the train. We're all stepping into this movement, and there's all this discussion of planting lots of trees and replanting our forests, right? But there's a fundamental gap between our ability to actually do that and the amount of wildfires and destruction that's happening year over year. So this paper, to speak to your question, Hal, basically highlights with really specific numbers in the West how many fires we've had in quantifiable acres since basically the 80s, looking backwards, where they've happened and what intensity has resulted in terms of regeneration failure. And then we use that to calibrate a model which projects our fire future the next 100 years. And it's pretty scary. It actually shows that the model that we are running is very conservative and largely less impactful than the actual fires that are happening if we go backwards. But if we go forwards, it's projecting, even as a conservative midline, a very scary fire future with millions of acres continuing to burn. And if we look at our capacity to address this with our current supply chains is a fraction of that, like less than a measurable percentage, a few single digit percentages are what we can actually actionably replant year after year. And the problem is fundamentally that we have supply chains that aren't mature, that aren't incentivized, are aimed at things like timber and fiber economies, and need to be aimed at things like ecology and other systems. So this work is really not intended to be hyperbole. It's meant to show the serious disconnect between wildfire and these mobilization efforts. And it shares that if we want to be improving on it, we need to go beyond the status quo for reforestation. We need to bring science to inform, how we actually plant forests. It can't be a plantation. It has to be structurally complex, the complexity of species, what we talked about with those genes and the different cover types in our earlier conversation. And then we need to put resilient forests in a position where they have stewards attached to them for very long periods of time. Durability of stewardship is the thing that no one's really sunk their teeth into. We're still at a very superficial phase. That's my personal priority right now, is just advocating for durable stewardship. And unfortunately, the only way to do that in our economy and many others is just incentives, right? We need a market to form around this. So the paper highlights this in excruciating detail. And if folks are interested, there's summaries, so you don't have to go into the technical jargon, but I think that would be a great place to start.
I think I got that one offline, and I think I saw a whole lot of people on the paper, and I tagged it onto your bio. So that'll go onto the website. You were touching on some of the things I was going to ask you. It's not just about timber, and it's not just about the ecology, but there's always other things that most people never think about that are connected with what's happening in the environment. And I would imagine that there's a lot of other products that can come from, like I was talking about the pine cones, for example.
Right.
But a lot of other residual money-making opportunities that could come from all this, whether it's staying in a forest, what's it mean to stay in a forest? Maybe a school in the forest, or, send your kids to the school in the forest out on the West Coast, and they'll have 2 weeks of connecting spiritually, mentally, physically with the environment and the trees, so that they have an idea of what it's like to live in a place like that. My mind just keeps going on and on and on about benefits that can come from something like this. And it's not about degradation. It's about building up what we lose when there's a fire.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And even when there's a fire, there's still benefits from the fire. Whether it's timber that's slightly burned that could be made into wood, to furniture, or, people look at that, oh, that's the great fire of such and such, and my table's made from it because, the stories that need to go with these things, I think would definitely make the value of this go up even higher than what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now you got me thinking there's so many benefits to dynamism on our landscape. And I use that term to basically say that a healthy landscape isn't static. It isn't just a bunch of trees growing until they mature and fall over and a new one grows. It's actually a very turbulent and dynamic mosaic. And that's fundamentally extremely important to what is a healthy ecosystem, because every one of those complexities and intricacies creates basically niche space for vertebrates, invertebrates, various microorganisms, habitat for all of these things in different consistencies, and really the complexity that allows a forest to be resilient, because the species diversity is what is able to take the impacts of, temperature fluctuations, wildfire, beetles invading, and a variety of other things in a more robust stride. So I guess, I'll say this: wildfire is actually a natural part of our landscapes in healthy, high frequency, but low intensity form. We've just put our landscape in a condition through commercial activity, climate change, so internal and external pressures, that it is built up to this powder keg, and we are now dealing with those consequences. So that's scary. But you're right. There's a ton of reasons why we can create value from a forest and cost savings. Value include things like recreational benefit. And I think you're right. Like just making forests accessible to people and an opportunity for people to leave these urban environments and go and relax and depressurize, that has incredible value for the soul, for physical well-being, but also recreation and engagement. But there's also other economies that form. So not only all the workers I'm talking about and all the benefit, but stewards we call them non-timber forest products. They can go and get berries, they can get mushrooms, they can get barks, they can get things for art, they can get things for commerce. There's so many different products, even the animals and things in the soil that they can extract, the fish in the streams in the forest. These are all benefiting from a reestablished, and those are revenue or commerce opportunities that are associated with healthy regrowing forests or established forests. But there's also opportunities for cost savings. And you said it, it's canopies create conditions that are better for all of us. Well, we think of the natural ones, we call them co-benefits, right? Like water sequestration. It slows down water fall through the soil so that watersheds can provide water to dry Western cities, as an example. But there's also a cooling effect.
Sure.
Or you plant forests near these cities in the West where we have heat domes, you're bringing temperature down And that means less air conditioning, which means less energy use on the grid. So there's cost savings that come with forests. There's so many benefits. And like, it's funny to watch these things getting unpacked. Not funny. I mean, it's really optimistic to see that these things are getting unpacked in, commercial conversations, right? Like conversation among policymakers and municipalities and heads of corporations now hiring sustainability officers saying like, maybe these things are important to us. It's like, okay, we can be cynical about it and say, yeah, duh. Or we can say, actually, it's about time. And like, how can I help? And that's kind of where I'm at right now. It's like, don't gatekeep. Try to give them as much as they can tolerate and see if they can't catalyze this change faster. Because I think we're all on the same page, but there are many who are just figuring out these benefits. And
the other thing I was thinking of is as a former professor at a university, assigning each student a camera that's situated in a woodland someplace in Oregon, and it's positioned on a map so that they could actually see where it's located. And they are responsible for overseeing that activity in that area with a camera. And they have to do documentation and, surmising different things and seeing the animals come through. And it's not taking them to the place because you have to use carbon to get them there, but they're sitting in their home observing. And, having these long distance relationships makes the place a sense that they wouldn't have otherwise. And that feeling of ownership of that particular area in Oregon, and I'm sitting in Philadelphia, would just blow people out of their mind. And say, okay, well, guess what I do? I oversee this little spot in Oregon. This is my job.
Yeah.
And it's my job for school because I have to document everything. And then my paper comes from that, and then you have accumulation of all these different papers. And then you find out that people are seeing the same thing across the whole board from their cameras. They're seeing all these different things, but then they realize that there's similarities that nobody ever realized. Those are the kind of things I think about.
I think that's awesome. So 2 things. Conservation opportunities will require full-time stewardship. I've said that already. So now imagine if your idea were to be part of some sort of regulatory system that encouraged, behavior. It was maybe voluntary, right? If we could figure out how to take advantage of all these technologies like 3D, goggles that are allowing people to enter the metaverse and actually, instead of some fictional scenario, actually put them in these real ecosystems and allow them to impact change or create oversight. I think that's brilliant. And I would be so bold as to say that technology exists. But again, it's like, how are we connecting the dots and who are we going to incentivize to create that type of opportunity? There's a writer I really like, scientist. You guys know who E.O. Wilson is, right?
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. I read Half Earth a long time ago, and I know that was his aggressive thumb on the scale saying, let's save half of everything. And, I don't know that we'll ever get there. But I love the idea that like half of the planet is protected from us and our meddling commercial interests. And one of the ways I would imagine is very similar to where your thought process is. Like, how do we create accountability? Well, we have all this technology. We can send in people that don't need food and bathrooms and fuel and all these things. We maybe send in a drone or some sort of wheeled, something that can provide that oversight and observe and collect data like you suggested and allow us to tend to these environments. So I don't think it's all that far-fetched. I'm an optimist. I
don't think it's far-fetched. And I think, so you find the commonality of the thread between all the different people who are watching their camera. Maybe the camera actually comes off the tree and can move around. And you actually see places that need additional seeding or, hey, here's an area that needs to have some additional trees planted. All of that comes under that heading of that person who's the steward of that area. And boy, oh boy, all of a sudden people are connected. And I think that that's one of the things that I know Hal and I talk about it a lot. When you do something that nobody else has done, or maybe, you don't know what an arborist does until you actually do what an arborist does. And then all of a sudden there's an appreciation. That's what I'm talking about. The appreciation of stewardship in an area that somebody would never think of stewarding.
Yeah, I think there's real importance there. I mean, this kind of reminds me that like there are some really impressive progress points, I'll call them, in the various technologies that are available to us, not only as scientists, but as stewards of the land. And it's giving us an opportunity to take those boots in the ground efforts and create a little more horsepower. So our ability for inference gets better so that we can restore landscapes that maybe are more reflective of the wild conditions that we came to with our big commercial interests, right, over the last century or centuries.
Right.
So some of these include LiDAR. So to your point about remote sensing, like LiDAR has improved dramatically, and LiDAR is light detection and ranging. So, it basically scanning these landscapes. And as the LiDAR technology gets better, not only do satellites get us high granularity perspectives on what the condition of the ground or the canopies are, but we're actually able to have terrestrial LiDAR systems. So people walk around with a LiDAR puck in a backpack, walking through the canopy, or people scanning the soil, either through drones or some other close to ground activity and getting some penetration. We're actually able to rebuild amazing visuals of what is happening that can't be detected just by the human eye, boots on the ground observation. So as an example, they found entire historic agricultural communities in the Amazon basin that have now all been regrown, and they thought it was all virgin forest. Well, it turns out it was all forest that had regrown in the centuries after, it was a tended landscape, right? And in North America, we're able to do the same, and we're able to look at forest cover. We're able to look at conditions with some precision after wildfire so that we can restore, something before and after to be more reflective of what could be resilient on that landscape in the future. In addition to LiDAR, we have things like eDNA technologies or acoustic monitoring. And I've been interfacing with this a lot and looking at things like biodiversity. We think of biodiversity, we think of megaflora, megafauna, the redwoods, a panda bear. But the reality is that biodiversity could be a variety of small invertebrates and microorganisms that live, in the soil, for example, in a forest. So things like eDNA and acoustic sampling are now starting to give us a better sense of what's happening below ground, root structures, and then getting us a snapshot of what kind of organisms have left their genetic trail underground and how we might restore these. So these have gone from a conceptual mode decades ago to now a very much practiced reality where we're building data sets. And I'm not a Star Trek person, but all of my colleagues who know the science fiction sphere in that sense have always said, we're going to have this thing like this scanner, like the folks in Star Trek did, where we were able to zap an area and actually get an understanding of what's been living there in real time. And that might be the future tool of the restoration practitioner, right? We might only be decades away from that, right? And that to me is really, really exciting because it'll allow those students that we're talking about to have that remote perspective, but also to be able to really have this high level of inference and ultimately help restore something that maybe has a positive impact on climate, on watersheds, on all these things that we've been talking about.
I think that's how they found rhizophagy, using those techniques that you're talking about, because our friend Jeff Lowenfels out in Alaska was talking about rhizophagy and how they had no idea that these organisms and their actions, converting and then reconverting and providing food and nutrients and then changing and morphing into some other being. It's just so mind-blowing, but we know that It's happening. We want to acknowledge it, but we sometimes don't want to acknowledge it because we don't want to recognize it as living things or living beings. We want to just pretend that they don't exist because that way we can continue to do the bad things that we've been doing. And I think that that's something that we really need to think about, because even the birds and the lichen and all of those kind of things are important, and yet we kind of gloss over them so that we can tend to ourselves rather than the environment.
Totally agree.
So, Matthew, with the time that we have left, there's a few kind of big topics we'd love to touch on. You were in Stockholm for the International Union of Forest Research Organizations. I'm going to let you pronounce the
acronym.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And anyway, tell us about your time there. It sounds like everyone in the world associated with forests and forest management and forest research was there. Maybe hit a few highlights on what your takeaways were.
Acronym's a mouthful. IUFRO is how we'll refer to it. IUFRO, which is also not super smooth, but this was an old organization run by foresters, so they're not branding experts. That being said, I've been going to this conference for, I want to say, almost 20 years, on and off for 20 years. So it's been around for quite a long time. And it is the gathering of all the apex of researchers and practitioners and biometricians and silviculturalists and scientists and students, lots of students. I started going when I was a student. So, out of the 3,500 folks that were out giving a talk or whatever it was, was, I would say half of that were undergraduates, graduates, up and coming apprentices and practitioners that were coming from all over the world to show their little piece of the pie, right? So really fantastic gathering. And there are all sorts of local chapter meetings all around the world that are more regionally specific or practice specific. So phenomenal meeting. And I've been fortunate because this year I've been doing a bit of a tour all over Europe and the US, giving a lot of these talks. So that was just one of the many where I'm able to go and proselytize and kind of work on some of the technical side of, practice. So presenting things like data from that Mind the Gap paper and the research there, but also really sharing and showcasing work that connects the scientists to real practitioner need. So I was at IUFRO on a panel with a variety of other folks from, seed conservationists and banking in Europe to agroforestry and food systems around seed in Africa and a few other folks. And my role was really to, frankly, evangelize for some of the challenges that we have in our reforestation supply chain. People, I think, minimize some of the complexity of what it takes to actually bring these seed systems together, blend it with both commercial incentives, but also with ecological relevance. And so I've been doing my best to do that and kind of pound the drum for stewardship as the means. The way to get traction is like training and incentivizing like people that are in those communities and will be there for decades. So that's what I was talking about at IUFRO. And I think it was pretty well received. And then the rest of my talks have been all over the board. And have allowed me to really get a lot of feedback on how people view some of these challenges. Like we're all stuck in our own ecosystems, echo chambers ecosystems, kind of the same thing, right? So when you get these global audiences together, we have to force ourselves to have much higher level conversations about what's relevant, right? We can't just be talking about our wildfire problems in the West or our, pick your problems of drought or an invasive pathogen or whatever it is in every other region. We have to zoom out and say, what drives forest management? Who owns the land? Who can pay for rehabilitating the land? How do we create policies that incentivize these good behaviors? How do we bring corporates to the table that are in the backyards of all of these forests, right? So it's been a really good exercise in doing that with all the other scientists and practitioners that need to be forcing ourselves to make this more accessible conversation for everyone else, frankly. So that's been good.
Well, now I know why we have the podcast.
Yeah, that's right.
So because we like listening to all this stuff and we love learning the new information out there, and hopefully our listeners feel the same way we do. But hearing about an event like this just makes everybody smile to know that there's things going on that we have no idea of until you bring it up and talk about it. And all those people who are really making a difference for our forests. I mean, that's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it feels good to be part of it. And because there's so few of us from a global perspective, it's energizing because when we get together in such a concentration, we realize, there's a lot of really smart people, way smarter than I am, working on this challenge. I've got so much to learn from them, and I've got so much to share with them. And hopefully when we go back to our respective holes, when we're one of many, we have a little more information to be excited about, to make a little more progress, right? So yeah, you're right. I mean, this is good. It's good. I wish these events were less technical and more accessible, but I think there's versions that are getting there, right? We're starting to see, conversation about natural resource management. It's now being called nature-based solutions. And, it's in places like New York Climate Week, right? Which is extremely diverse and at the center of commerce and commercialism. And, the lay public is there and investors are there and bankers are there, but also people who are branding experts and policymakers, and so they get a little glimpse of that. It ain't as technical as IUFRO, but, it makes it available to the surface of what is going to be progress in our society.
Well, and I also think it takes us out of our silos because years ago, everybody was siloed. I remember when I was going to the university over in England and, the people in the English department didn't know anybody in the horticulture department, God forbid, And I was this person from the United States introducing the English faculty department to the horticulture department. And both of them were writers, but never knew each other. And I was like, What? How does that happen? And you're in the same university and you're just a building away. Like, how does that happen? So I think that that's an important component of what you're talking about. Bringing down the silos, letting people intermingle, learning from each other, learning different disciplines. It actually gives each discipline a different perspective of where they are in the global economy and what they're doing environmentally too. I think that's critical.
Yeah, and somehow, Matt, you really do exude optimism. So I want to thank you for that.
Thanks. I'm an eternal optimist. It drives my wife crazy, but I think we balance each other out. So
I think that's one of the things that they're talking about, even generally speaking, that people need to be more optimistic. I mean, you could be depressed, but you could still be optimistic.
Yeah.
And optimism will get us much further down the line. And I think a lot of new inventions come from optimism. You wouldn't continue to try if you didn't believe that there was an opportunity for some new thing to happen.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of Matthew's antidepressants is he mentioned he was in the field earlier today. So I don't know what he was doing. Was it working with saplings but on the other hand, you've also seen some devastated burn fields, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess to your point about optimism and then my medicine for it, that is exactly right. I'm optimistic because things are coming online that I never thought would come online in my career. The voluntary carbon markets, commercializing nature. It sounds bad, but it's going to funnel resources towards the other thing that gives me optimism, which is all the new stewards that are coming to do this, all the new cone collectors, all the new nursery people, all the new nonprofit professionals and professionals, like this carbon market, like it didn't exist in the way it does a few years ago. People now have vice president of carbon in their title. And that is totally made up. There are no MBA case studies that really reflect on this in depth yet. And that gives me hope because all of a sudden we have a way to measure our progress that is important to commercial entities that have a lot of resources and money. So we have an opportunity for progress. And I think what sets me apart from others in this space is I still absolutely want to be close to the land because I don't want to ever be a charlatan on one side, evangelizing for something that I don't understand. And I don't want to lose touch with the people that actually do the work. So I love going out. I was covered head to toe in dust yesterday, and I had loved every minute of it. It reminded me of being a student 20 years ago. And I hope that in 10 years, if I'm still in this field, I'm just as passionate because I've been rolling around in the mud with the people that are right on the land, boots on the ground, because that's where the impact happens. So with all the VR, all the satellites, all the eDNA, and all the things coming, someone's going to have to ground truth that. And I want to be on the front lines of that. And I want to be able to incentivize the people that do that work. So getting out once or twice a week is medicine, but it's also good practice. And I encourage others to do that. And
that's proven medicine too, because soil gives off the microbiome of soil gives off healthy attributes. So I think you're right about that. And I do believe a lot of people do get separated from that, what you're talking about, being able to touch the reality and being able to see past reality and connecting the two to make them come together.
Yeah.
I really think that is something that we need more of. Again, going back to the feeling of understanding what the fireman goes through, understanding what the farmer goes through, gives you a better appreciation of your food, the person who's putting out the fire.
Absolutely.
You can't appreciate it more than when you are right there with it. And, I commend you for that.
Yeah. My motivation here is at some point I'll be feeding the roots. So get as much done as I can.
I was just thinking about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Make me biochar.
Yeah, man. I'm with you, Al. Totally.
Yeah. The biochar one was pretty good too. That was a really interesting podcast. That's a whole nother story.
Yes. Well, we're all connected. And Matthew, we want to thank you for your time, your optimism, your great smile. I think I'm set for the rest of the day, at least, with hopeful outlook. So thank you for your time and joining us. And, I know, I did want to ask, how often does the UFRO meet? That's not annual, is it?
So they meet all the time. Every quarter, there's tons of meetings.
Oh, wow.
There's annual meetings. And then the one that we had was, I think it was the big conference that maybe is, I want to say every year or every few years. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Gotcha.
It was the International Congress. The last one I was in was in Germany. So they have these all over the place and they're quite big.
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
And we've already asked you your favorite tree, unless you want to give us a new one.
Actually, you have me thinking about this. I just a short quip. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have right now is that there's this old expression, an English expression, you can't see the forest for the trees. It's hard for me to pick my favorite thing or favorite anything really. in the forest. I just love the fact that there are still places where there's incredible complexity on the landscape. And I think people get overtly focused on resilience or risk, and they think about individual trees or individual stands. And what I love for people to walk away with is to zoom out. And a healthy landscape or a healthy forest is really a dynamic, intricate place. And it's going to have parts that are dying, parts that are regenerating, parts that are burning, parts that are cooling, parts that are saving water, parts that are dry. Like that is how we should be viewing forests. So like, don't think about forests as a plantation. Think about forests as this dynamic landscape, right? So that's kind of my takeaway image, if you'll allow me that. Is start to look at the forest for the landscape and what it provides. It's a benefit.
Look at it as your favorite fabric.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's a mosaic. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. We really appreciate you being on our podcast. And wow, there's a lot to think about.
You guys are awesome. I love your podcast. So keep going, please. And I'd love to recommend guests to you because there's plenty of excitable folks like me. So
we appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromedan Recordings in Hollywood, California.